Okay, so welcome everyone, and we are recording, so don't do anything that you don't want to be left with posterity, because the great thing about recording is that colleagues who aren't able to be here with us now will be able to come in later and hear Leslie's presentation. So thanks in advance, Leslie, for giving us permission to do that. And I have to say, we have been thrilled by the silver lining of Zoom seminar has been, of course, that we can have wonderful people from all over the place who we normally can't find a way to drag to London. And this week is certainly a particular highlight for me and for the late antiquarians of the group, because we've got Leslie Dossey, who many of you will know as having written the marvelous book on peasant and empire in Roman Africa, which really changed our understanding of, on the one hand, the economy, and on the other hand, the religious environment of late antiquity, certainly in Africa itself, and possibly by implication in some other places as well. But one of the particularly exciting things that Leslie did was to bring together archaeological study, particularly kind of understanding the implications of what's going on with the pottery and with consumer culture and the economic environment. And then on the other hand, sermons. And Leslie is one of the people who really knows her African sermons, which is just this incredibly elite category of person. And I think one of the very few people we even know of, much less know, who actually is fluent in the anonymous sermons of Roman Africa, as well as in the better known writers like Augustine. So, and probably many of you will know her article in Past and Present on wife beating in late antiquity. Maybe fewer of you will know her work on the anonymous text on Job. But I have to say it's incredibly exciting to have a chance to hear what Leslie has been up to. And with that, I will hand over to Leslie for her talk on lighting.
Great.
Over to you, Leslie.
After that introduction, you might be surprised I'm not going to be mentioning North Africa really at all in this talk. This is the results of a new project on the history of the night in late antiquity. And I found to my sorrow that most of the developments that were interesting were taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so that has been the focus of my work, although I make some comparisons to the West in this talk, especially to Italy. So to start with, I'm going to share a PowerPoint in a bit, but first I would like you to just look at my background right here, my virtual background, which is the bright lights of Chicago, where I live. The Chicago metropolitan area has the 4th worst level of light pollution in the world, with rather nasty effects on the animals, plants, and humans who attempt to live here. In this respect, ancient Roman cities were woefully inadequate. Despite their large populations, they were very dark. Only in late antiquity, around the middle of the 4th century, do we hear about the first systematic efforts on the part of the city or imperial governments to install street lighting. When government mandated lighting is attested for cities like Antioch, Ephesus, and Constantinople. The goal of my talk today is to describe the institution of lighting in these cities and then attempt to explain it. Now, Antioch's street lights are by far the best known because of the works of the 4th century orator Libanius. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, does that work? Okay, great. So Antioch in this late Roman period had some maybe 300,000 people, maybe somewhat less, but still quite a large population, and was one of the most important commercial centers of the Eastern Empire. Libanius first mentions its bright lights in his panegyric on Antioch, written in 356. He boasted that the citizens of Antioch have repudiated the tyranny of sleep from our eyelids. The lamps of the sun are supplanted by different lanterns, which outdo the illumination of the Egyptians. Among us, the night differs from day in only one respect, in the form of light. Handicrafts go on as usual, with some people energetically working with their hands and others releasing themselves to laughter and song. Now notice here how he associates the lighting with both night work and night leisure activities. And he goes on in the same oration to connect it to night retail. Travelers arriving at night in Antioch could easily find a place to buy their dinner or refresh themselves, for the shops and the baths remained open. This was in 356. Libanius adopted a more critical tone toward the streetlights 30 years later, when in another oration, he was criticizing the governor of Syria for requiring that the workshops provide lights outside their doors at night. And the governor, Tisamenus, had been claiming that conditions in the workshops and related to trade had gotten better under his administration. Libanius pointed out two recent impositions that were anything but better. The governor had forced the workshops to have their doorways painted, presumably with the name of artisan and trade, as we know from other Eastern cities like Palmyra. And he also required them to triple the amount of lighting. These same people in the workshops, he orders to provide triple the amount of fire in the night. Notice the word triple here, which implies that there was a way to count the numbers of lights, something we will return to below. The men of the night watch now patrolled the streets and pounded on the door of any workshop not burning the required numbers of lights. Libanius dramatized the resistance of a poor widow who lived upstairs from her shop, crying when the night watch came pounding, "How can I light them? Where can I get the oil from? For long enough now, I have never tasted a drop of it." Libanius concluded this oration by questioning the very purpose of street lighting, and also gave us a hint about its justification. And yet, why all the zeal about this fire? Why is there so much for a sleeping city? It's my title of my talk. For those who are sleeping, it would be beside the point, and for the watch, the previous amount is enough. Can you say that there were fewer criminals now, or that there were more before? Now here, Libanius is probably exaggerating the extent to which the shopkeepers would have been sleeping when the lights were lit, just as he had exaggerated in 356 when he claimed that Antioch had done away with the difference between night and day altogether. What rings true, though, is one, that this lighting was expensive and often paid for by the shop owners. And two, as with the street lighting today, it was justified by connecting it to public safety, the truth of which Libanius, as many public safety experts today, chose to doubt. Now, I will return to Libanius's criticism of street lighting later, but first it is important to establish its nature and extent. Antioch was not alone in getting lighting, public lighting, in the late 4th and 5th centuries. Here's a map, shows some of the other places. I apologize for its quality, it's not my forte. Some of the other places where we have textual references to publicly provided lighting in this period: Constantinople, Ephesus, Caesarea, Antioch, Edessa, and some dispute this, but possibly Alexandria. Libanius' near contemporary, Basil of Caesarea, referred to city-financed lamps, or rather the loss of them, around 371, when Caesarea stopped being a provincial capital. In Constantinople, the Emperor Theodosius II ordered that the rents from the houses and the shops of the colonnades near the famous public bath of Zeuxippus should be used for the provision of lights. This sort of government-financed lighting was often popular. The historian Priscus records how the 5th century urban prefect of Constantinople, Cyrus, arranged that the evening lights be kindled at the workshops, and the night lights too. This was around 440 CE. The reaction of the populace was ecstatic, and the factions of the hippodrome shouted for him the whole day. Constantine founded the city, Cyrus revived it. By the end of the 5th century, governors in Edessa, the capital of the province of Osrochina, were requiring the shopkeepers to hang cross-shaped light fixtures with 5 lamps each outside their shops on the Sabbath. And he redirected the public oil from the church lamps to be used to light up the city's colonnades. It was expected that most cities would use part of their revenues for the public lights by Justinian's time. But what did this lighting actually look like? One piece of my own research has been to connect the street lighting to the late antique invention of the glass lamp. Libanius clearly indicates that these were hanging lights, dangling from ropes in front of doorways. This copious and idle lighting, and I quote Libanius here, this copious and idle lighting which hangs in front of the bathhouses. When Antioch faced a serious public riot in 387, partly in protest of taxation, the rioters cut, and here I quote again, cut the ropes from which were hung those things providing the light in the night. Now, the ancient world had long made use of hanging metal and ceramic lamps, but Libanius's phrasing and his avoidance of the normal words for lamps suggests that he was referring to the glass lamp fixtures of late antiquity, a relatively new invention when he was writing. Several reused inscriptions from Ephesus, one of the largest cities of the Eastern Empire and the capital of Asia, confirmed this impression that the street lighting would have often taken the form of glass lamps. These inscriptions, dated to the Theodosian period between 379 and 450, record the number of candelae on certain streets. For example, the street of the horses, together with the dark alley, had 18 candelae. A more important thoroughfare, the Arcadiani, named after the Emperor Arcadius, which led from the theater to the harbor, has, as the quote shows here, 2 colonnades and 50 candelae up to the Boar monument. These utilitarian, not commemorative inscriptions give us an idea of how the night watchmen would have known how many lights they were supposed to light, that were supposed to be lit on a certain stretch of street. They also hint at the type of lamp being used. Employing the term candela, borrowed from the Latin, instead of the more literary light or lamp. In early Byzantine sources, the candela was the term for the glass oil lamp. Now, the glass oil lamp was a 4th century invention that has been called by Margaret O'Hay the most significant technological innovation of late antique architectural fittings. The chronology of these lamps in the archaeological record fits very well with the first textual references to street lighting. By the early 350s, just 5 years before Libanius was praising the streetlights of Antioch, a regular standardized mass production of glass lamps had begun. And this was at Jalaim up here in Israel. There were other production centers as well that have been excavated. Although the scholarship on glass lamps has generally focused on their use for church and later mosque lighting, there is plenty of archaeological evidence that for their abundance in secular contexts. In fact, I would suggest that this was their earliest use. These lamps were filled with water and oil with a cloth or fiber wick for lighting. The oil floated over the water, allowing it to be used more efficiently than in solely oil lamps. They came in a variety of shapes. Some were beakers with turned out rims, cone-shaped, and decorated with blue blobs, as in this one. Attractive products, not luxurious, but still meant to be seen. So these are some of the Egyptian Karanis glass lamps, some of our earliest 4th century examples. Others were more like stemmed wine goblets or hemispherical bowls with 3 handles for hanging. As time went on, this type became disturbingly utilitarian, almost like a light bulb. The end of the wick needed to reach the top layer of the oil and avoid coming in direct contact with the glass. It was held in place either by means of a metal wick holder or, as in this one, glass or ceramic tubes attached to the base of the vessel, or a hollow stem base, as here. The lamps were hung by inserting their rims and their stems or their rims into the holes of circular lamp holders, sometimes made of glass themselves, or by attaching their handles to metal chains or ropes. Their paper-thin walls made them lighter and easier to hang in groups than ceramic or metal lamps. Now, what was really revolutionary about the glass lamp was that when hung from the ceiling or other high place, glass lamps could do what no classical lighting device had ever done before: light up an entire room or portico stall. Because the lamps were translucent, light traveled down, not just up, as with the classical clay or metal lamp. The water that filled the lower portion of the lamp collected intensified the light of the flame. The whole lamp would glow rather like a Chinese lantern. Light emission studies have shown that glass lamps burn about twice as brightly and somewhat longer than ceramic lamps, although the downside is that they use twice as much oil. Moreover, the glass lamps were used in groups, with 3 or more lamps being placed together. A new term, the polycandlon, was invented for these light fixtures. Now, once these glass lamps began to be attested, mass-produced glass lamps appear almost everywhere, a virtual explosion of glass lamps across the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans in the second half of the 4th century. They've been found in both Athens and Petra in contexts dated before the 360s. They were thick on the ground in Alexandria, as well as in smaller Egyptian cities like Karanis, a way station for the various products of the imperial Annona. Numerous wick holders for glass lamps have been found in Antioch, though not well published. At Ephesus, excavators have recovered many examples of handled and wine glass shaped lamps, glass lamps, at the residential terrace houses, the Byzantine governor's palace, and excavations at the Agora. The best preserved glass lamps come from ecclesiastical or domestic contexts, especially the popular apsed dining rooms that were becoming all the rage in late antiquity. But they were just as common in the sort of colonnade and workshop area that the textual sources would place public street lighting. In the shops, colonnades, and bathhouses of Alexandria, in the commercial area near the theater of Corinth, the workshop and theater areas of Gerasa, and the colonnades and shops of early 6th century Scythopolis. At Keranis, the surface surveys have found the highest percentage of conical glass lamps in the industrial areas of the town. Here's an image from a 6th century church of Alexandria showing a glass lamp hanging in the arch of a colonnade. Now, glass lamps never became as popular in Europe as in the Eastern Mediterranean, at least not in secular context. Around 400 CE, Paulinus of Nola and Prudentius wrote about their use in churches and in bishops' houses with an enthusiasm suggestive of novelty. Archaeological remains of glass lamps dated around 400 appear in some of the same sort of secular urban contexts as in the East. In the shops of the Palatine in Rome, quite profusely in the sewers of Classe, the port of Ravenna, in the Forum area of one town in Portugal. Yet by the second half of the 5th century, they mainly come from churches or cemeteries in the West. Now, all of these glass lamps, which joined rather than replaced the traditional ceramic lamps, would have consumed a truly tremendous amount of oil. Although residue analysis shows that their owners filled them with any oil they could get, including radish, canola, castor, linseed, sesame, even rendered lard. Olive oil was the norm. According to the first redaction of the 6th century Liber Pontificalis, Constantine gave property with rents of 4,390 solidi a year for the main purpose of providing the lights for the Lateran Basilica in Rome. And I get this detail from a fascinating article just published by Benjamin Graham on the oil lighting of churches in the early medieval West, which he thinks were largely glass lamps too. We should take seriously Libanius's complaint that the requirement to light the lamps was driving the price of olive oil beyond some consumers' reach. Certainly not everyone was happy about them. The rioters in Antioch in 387 targeted the lamps, cutting down the ropes from which the lamps were hung outside the bathhouse doors, probably because they saw them as a fiscal imposition. In the aftermath of the riot, Libanius suggested that the Boule cut this copious and idle lighting, this display of useless luxury, to a fraction of what it is now. The fact that they appear to have been an imposition on shopkeepers, i.e. the middle class, by governors, certainly didn't help their popularity. And this begs the question, Libanius's question, that is the title of this talk. Why all this zeal about lighting? Why was so much light needed? Rarely does technology change on its own accord without some sort of new demand stimulating it. Had something in people's nighttime behavior changed to drive this technological innovation? And why at this point in Greek and Roman history in the late 4th century? Now, to understand the institution of lighting in late antiquity, I think it's useful to look at the reasons behind the later reinvention of street lighting in the 17th century. Now, this also started with oil lamps, which were placed in glass-paned lanterns and hung in European cities from the late 17th century on. Starting in the 1660s in Paris and Amsterdam and spreading quickly to other European cities, royal officials began to systematically require and sometimes pay for oil lanterns, replacing the more haphazard arrangement of lanterns that residents may have chosen to put outside their houses or shops. City governments were reluctant to undertake the expense of it. Generally, their rulers had to compel them to, citing concerns about safety, morality, or simply city beautification. Recent scholarship, most importantly, Craig Koslowski's 2011 book, Evening's Empire, has viewed this street lighting not in isolation, but as part of a broader change in how people were using the night in the 16th and 17th centuries. There was a new tendency for urban dwellers to remain in the public sphere into the evening. The shift was not so much among the poor, the apprentices, prostitutes, and servants who had long made use of the streets at night, as among the urban upper classes. By the late 17th century, the hours of dinner and bedtime in court and upper class circles had moved more than 4 hours later than they had been in the 16th century. The respectable classes began to stay out in the public sphere later, going to late dinner parties and entertainments and strolling around the city shops. The new lighting facilitated this, giving the respectable classes a sense of safety and comfort and distinguishing their own nocturnal sociability from the nightlife of the apprentices, boys, maids, and other such unmarried folk found idly in the streets. And I'm quoting Koslowski here. So was something similar happening in late antiquity? Was there a shift? And I'm stopping the PowerPoint now. Was there a shift to people staying out in the public spaces later in the evening, especially among the respectable classes? And if so, why? Now, according to the mainstream scholarship on everyday life in antiquity, most people in the early Roman Empire, or at least the sort of people our sources reflect, had kept remarkably early hours. The 5th or 6th hour was the traditional lunchtime, followed by a short siesta. The hours of the shops and baths were heavily weighted to the diurnal, from noon to evening, as Vitruvius said at the baths, and most shops closed earlier. If night work was done, it was usually by getting up before dawn, rather than staying up late. Dinner, the Latin cena or the Greek depnon, began in the afternoon, typically at the 9th hour of the day, so around our 3 p.m. For example, in the probably Alexandrian novel, Leucippe and Clitophon, now dated to the reign of Antoninus Pius, people got their main meal, depnon, in the afternoon and ended it when it was still light. The men in Greek fashion prolonged their meal by drinking, but not much past nightfall. In literature from this period, the lamps and torches came out only at the last stage of the meal. For example, in Athenaeus, where every stage of a banquet is discussed in excruciating detail, his guests only ask for lights at the end of the festivities, mainly in the form of torches, to help light the way home. Once home, one lamp was usually sufficient to get a person to bed. Now, this darkness of the night in the early imperial period didn't mean that people always spent the night quietly at home. Anything but. They traveled, they went fishing, they partied at night. The Panoukis, the all-night festival, was still quite popular in sources from the 2nd and 3rd century CE. Travel on horseback or donkey back at night was very common. I've traced this through the Egyptian papyri. Relied on the excellent night vision of horses and donkeys who needed no artificial light. What was uncommon was for people to attempt to engage in activities like shopping or work. That was better done by the light of day. And the freedom of the night from this sort of work was regarded not as a limitation, but as the right of a free man, or possibly even a human right. There is a saying of Menander that I have found echoed in a wide range of early imperial authors. The night brings rest, the day makes work. It was inconceivable that a man of respectable status should be required to work at night. The Homeric Problems, an anonymous Greek sophistic text, probably of the 1st century CE, is a case in point. When discussing why Homer portrayed Hephaestus as working at night, the author refused to believe that the divine smith actually engaged in nocturnal labor. He doesn't represent Hephaestion as someone so wretched and unlucky that he doesn't have a break from his artisan work, even at night. For it is considered unusual, even among wretched people, not to have a holiday from their toil at night. No, this is not the meaning of Hephaestus forging Achilles' armor. He then went on to give his allegorical interpretation of the passage. Early imperial medical authors, such as Galen, would agree. Galen considered working into the night after dinner as devastating to one's health, although a one-night vigil could be undertaken without any harm. In fact, it was better to stay up one night completely than to sleep only a portion of the night. So what a sociologist Helmut Rosa has termed temporal regulation still functioned in the early imperial period. Collective rhythms underpinned by institutional processes like the polis, the contract, the guild, Roman and customary law. Street lighting wasn't needed because people weren't supposed to be trying to do the same things at night that they did during the day. So what was different about late antiquity, which I'm defining as the 4th through 6th centuries? In Latin sources from the 4th and 5th centuries, daily hours appear to have changed only a little. Authors such as Augustine, Paulinus, and Sidonius all attest to lunch, prandium, in the 5th or 6th hour of the day. Baths were taken during the daytime before meals, ideally before prandium. People began their cena, their cena, shortly before evening, that is somewhat later than in the classical period. And the rich at least were assumed to dine by lamp or candlelight. Despite somewhat later dinner hour, bedtime remained early. Petrus Chrysologus, the bishop of the imperial headquarters of Ravenna in the first half of the 5th century, preached of, and I quote, gentle sleep first pouring itself on the bodies of those sleeping in the 1st or 2nd or 3rd hour of the night. In these Western texts, the use of lamps outside of the house is still associated more with people getting up extremely early and during the long nights of winter, rather than staying in the public sphere in the late evening. The bishop at Maximus of Turin, preaching during Christmastide in the first half of the 5th century, refers to people using a lamp before dawn for practical purposes. And a lamp wasn't necessary in all cases. The aristocratic churchman Anodius of Pavia, writing in the summer of 508, describes riding his horse at night under the stars and the moonlight. In the early pre-dawn, when, and I quote, the crowd of stars had not yet lost their light from the brightness of the sun. All told, Latin texts do not suggest a dramatic shift towards later hours. The Greek East, however, is completely different. The timing of everyday activities in Eastern Mediterranean sources from the same period is dramatically different. Urban dwellers, at least, were strolling, bathing, and dining later in the day than had been the norm in early imperial authors. Lunch, ariston, and the siesta that followed it moved into the slot once occupied by deipnon in the late afternoon. In Libanius's Antioch, the governors were finishing their lunch in the afternoon when petitioners began to show up and prevent them from taking their postprandial siesta. The petitioners then stayed with them until evening in the lamps, which wasn't far off. The patristic sources allow us to pinpoint the transition from afternoon lunch to siesta time as around the 9th hour. When commenting on the verse in Acts about the apostles Peter and Paul being in the temple around the 9th hour, John Chrysostom explained, around the 9th hour, at a time when other men are sleeping off their lunch and drinking and drink with a deep sleep, these men are alert and awake. This afternoon siesta that followed lunch often didn't end until dusk was approaching. And I quote Chrysostom again, but after you have had lunch and slept, when you head out to the marketplace and see the day already pressing on toward evening, come out to this church. We seem to be on the way toward the traditional double day schedule of portions of Egypt or Greece in more recent times, where people take a break in the afternoon for a substantial lunch and siesta before returning to the public sphere around dusk. Baths were now frequently taken in the evening. Libanius and his associates, after strolling or riding around the city in the late afternoon dusk, generally bathed when it got dark. John Chrysostom similarly assumes that men would bathe in the evening after leaving the marketplace and before going home for dinner. The governor's baths were particularly popular in the evening as an avenue for asking favors. Evening bathing may be one possible reason for the growing late antique popularity of semi-private baths attached to luxury residences, since these smaller baths would have been significantly easier to light at night. The so-called Byzantine palace at Ephesus, where numerous glass lamps have been found, may be an example of this. Shopping was also becoming an evening activity. When trying to dissuade celibates from living with virgins, Chrysostom warned them that they would end up spending their evening without dinner in the workshops, purchasing the perfume, linens, tints, and various other items that the virgins would need. In another sermon, he mentioned that in Antioch, you could pass time in the marketplace, the agora, very late in the evening, in complete fearlessness, a likely allusion to the greater sense of safety brought by the public lights. In Constantinople, during the time of the historian Priscus, even a woman might do her shopping in the evening by lamplight, although not always with positive results, as will be discussed below. In these Eastern Mediterranean cities, the second meal of the day, deipnon, was now clearly an evening or even a night meal. Dinner started in the evening, not only in the writings of Libanius, but in a variety of authors, ranging from 4th century novelist Heliodorus to the 5th century Egyptian epic poet Nonus, to Christian sermon writers and exegetes such as John Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria, and Theodoret of Cyrus. The lighting that was needed in early authors to get home after dinner was now desirable to go to dinner, as well as to light up the house, both inside and out, during the preparations for the meal. As Libanius describes in Oration 7, people in the evening proceeded by torchlight from the bathhouses to their luxurious depna dinners, while the ragged beggars in front of the baths asked for bread or coin. This was during the long nights of winter. Cyril of Alexandria, writing in the spring of 414, describes much the same thing. Those going from public spaces, and I quote here, arm themselves with torches against the darkness of the night, and they do not submit their home to the blackening evening. Instead, by festooning their dwelling with lamps, they drive out the gloom from the darkness with sparklings. In John Chrysostom's sermons, people lit their portable lamps in the agora before returning home, being careful not to dally and use up the oil before reaching the house. Then the lamps at home were also lit up. The public street lighting shouldn't be seen in isolation, but as part of this broader network of lighting that stretched from the streets to people's hands to their homes. And here we find one reason why governors may have wanted to provide street lighting that went beyond the torches people carried for themselves to make the streets safer. Moving around in the dark in these continually refurbished cities was itself dangerous. Cyril's sermons are full of the dangers of walking in the streets without light at night, not because you might be seen up to no good, as in his Italian contemporary, Maximus of Turin, but because you might stumble into a hole. Yet the lamps could themselves pose a danger if held in hand. Priscus narrated a particularly unfortunate shopping trip by a working woman who visited a store around the hour of the lamps in Constantinople. She was herself carrying a lamp, and by setting it down carelessly, ended up setting a large portion of Constantinople on fire. Sidewalk and shop lighting were a better solution, for they could eliminate the need for a torch altogether. However, we still haven't answered the question of why. Why were people keeping these later hours in the face of serious inconvenience of engaging in practical activities in the dark? I believe the answer is that the length of people's work days were increasing, pushing activities like bathing, shopping, and dining into the night. Evidence of this can be found at the highest levels of society. Libanius wrote to the Emperor Julian about officials who had used to bathe and rest before the middle of the day. Under a strict new governor, they now toiled the whole day and some of the night before the governor's doors. Libanius approved. He was sensitive himself of being seen as shirking work for leisure. When taking a break from his school duties because of illness, he was spotted at the baths around midday. For illness in my head makes this my practice. The point of his letter, though, was to refute any idea that he was enjoying leisure. The demands on his time were just as onerous as ever. Keeping early hours was something to apologize for they suggested you may not be sufficiently devoted to work. Cyril of Alexandria appears to have been defending Jesus Christ against a similar impression of laziness when trying to explain to his audience why Jesus was described in the Gospels as resting at a well in the 6th hour of the day. He can easily, and I quote, refute the charge of luxury, since this was the hottest and therefore the most suitable time of the day, especially for a traveler. In another of his sermons, even the 10th hour of the day was not an appropriate time for rest for the truly diligent. He holds up the example of the apostles who are found staying in a house with Jesus at the 10th hour of the day. They were not in any way resting, but rather served as an example of scholarly toil. The disciples were assiduously being instructed in the knowledge of the divine mysteries. For I do not think it is right, Cyril says, for those desirous of knowledge to have an easily sated disposition, but rather a toil-loving one. A toil-loving disposition was now desired in the highest echelons of late imperial society, including Christian academic circles of Alexandria. It was demonstrated by spending the day and often part of the evening working. Governors themselves were expected to work nights in this period. As Libanius writes, evening not uncommonly finds them in court, and the verdict which takes away their dinner still doesn't end the case. In his declamation on servitude, the night drives the governors to the law court with the complete neglect of baths and dinner, and bearing the want of sleep on his eyelids. Now, of course, in the trickle-down economics of late antiquity, it wasn't only the elite who would have been, in essence, and I had to say this once during this presentation, burning the midnight oil, while the artisan class slept comfortably in their beds. Someone had to man the shop and the bathhouse. Moreover, those who were themselves working into the night were unlikely to sympathize with workers who kept more traditional hours. In Oration 20, Libanius tells the story of a unit of 500 soldiers who were forced to do night shifts baking bread in addition to their regular daytime duties. And so they could get no sleep. They ended up rebelling and proclaiming their general emperor and adopting, for a short time, a life of leisure. When there was a bread crisis in Antioch, Libanius himself persuaded the Bakers' Guild to spend the whole night, evening to dawn, in their shops baking. John Chrysostom describes apprentices as both having their lunch and passing their nights in their teachers' homes, in contrast to early imperial practice of letting apprentices go home at dusk. I would suggest that there was a society-wide adoption of longer and later working hours in the late antique Eastern Mediterranean, and an erosion of the cultural protections that had once reserved the night for leisure. The increasingly ugly glass lamps are part of the evidence for this. To conclude, the proliferation of glass lamps in the 4th and 5th centuries, of which street lighting was only the tip of the iceberg, is not simply an interesting change in lighting technology. It represents a transformation of people's daily hours, at least in the Eastern Mediterranean. Routine activities such as bathing, dining, working, and shopping that had previously been done during the day were being pushed back into the evening and even into the night. This meant that there was a greater need for lighting in all sorts of contexts, bringing about change in both lighting technology and people's habits. Imperial officials were willing to accommodate these changes by attempting to institute street lighting because they were themselves part of what was driving a change in people's hours. But why don't we see the same degree of change in the late antique West? Well, in the peak period of change, early 5th century, Europe was in turmoil. Goths were marching on Rome, followed by the Vandal invasion of North Africa and a degree of deurbanization. But the West may have also been better at preserving independent, aristocratic, and ecclesiastical power and protecting nighttime leisure. I find it interesting that the Donatist bishops, after the Council of Carthage in 411, appealed to the emperor against the imperial judge's decision against them, in part because it had been issued at night, nocte. Earlier Roman law had forbidden trials past sunset. Ennodius, a hardworking man, still considered himself free to spend his night writing under the starlight and to write about it. There was still a social cachet to nighttime leisure. So there's two takeaways for me in understanding a takeaway for both late antiquity and perhaps ourselves. This research has made very real to me how the growing power of the imperial government and the loss of civic institutions in the East affected people's everyday lives. And it also has made me concerned about the loss of temporal regulation in our own society, the regular closing times, the 8-hour workday, the holidays, the distinction between work time and leisure time, things people of the past fought for, and we have let go under the belief that it is a mark of professional importance to be on call at all times. And the pretty city of lights behind me have become less attractive. Sometimes it may be better to let the night be dark.